Welcome to the third of our series of conversations on housing as a part of our joint forecast conference, virtual conference with the Ziman Institute for Real Estate here at UCLA Anderson. We're now going to focus on a key issue here in California, housing affordability. And to explore this, Professor Ed Leamer will now have a conversation with Conor Dougherty, which we're really looking forward to. Conor is an economics reporter at the New York Times, focusing on the West Coast on real estate and wage stagnation amongst U.S. workers. He previously covered these topics for the Wall Street Journal, the San Diego Union Tribune, and the Los Angeles Business Journal, and is the author of a new book on affordability in California, Golden Gates. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Ed and Conor. Ed, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. This is a great experience. I've read this book. I really enjoyed it. I need to say a few more things about introducing you. You were a major in chemistry at UC San Diego. So I'm wondering what path brought you to where you are now. Taught high school math at Berkeley, became a researcher for the Los Angeles Business Journal, became a reporter, and then worked for the San Diego Union Tribune, the Wall Street Journal before joining the New York Times in 2014. I've had many conversations with Conor, and it's really great to see his face as well as interact with him over this episode. The title that Jerry referred to is Golden Gates, but the subtitle is Fighting for Housing in America. And the first thing I want to ask Conor is about journalistic objectivity and truth, and the Tom Cotton crisis at the New York Times.
Oh, come on.
And the reason I do that is I really like your style, and I'm used to reading academics, and I have to plod and force myself to go sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph. But you create a kind of novel, as to what I would say, out of the facts that keeps me interested and keeps me operating. So I want to read a little bit of your prose so the audience gets a sense of what this book is like. And it's not a boring academic book. It's fun to read. There's lots of characters in here that you'll be interested in reading about, but here's the style. You almost had to squint to see it. The language is communicating things that are subtle. And here's one that really stuck out as I read this book. Rick met his wife, Nancy, in high school and married her before he could drink. And they were still together and lived just a few miles from their childhood homes. I'm thinking, what is Conor trying to say with that? So the question is, back to journalism and objectivity and truth. So to me, this book is totally truthful, but not necessarily objective. So what do you say about first of all, how'd you get that style, Conor, which is rather distinctive, and how is that style met in the journalistic world?
Well, thank you for your kind words. I really wanted to, let me just start by saying I'm fascinated by economics, and I read all sorts of papers and all sorts of research. And but ultimately the economy is about people. It's about how are we doing as a country? How well are we, what is the bounty, and how well is that bounty being shared? And how can we maybe do a better job of that? And I think that rooting the stories in people and characters and their lives, and sort of showing how the invisible hand is kind of moving them around like chess pieces sometimes, we start to really understand the stakes of GDP or housing affordability or anything else. And also, you just want, as you say, people to turn the pages. Sonia is a bombastic character who has this lovely personal story. She's kind of started to try political movements at various points in her life, has pretty much failed, has had, tried to get a PhD in economics, but basically failed out, was, working the night shift, twisting pretzel dough at one point. and just kind of eventually found herself and found her calling in activism in San Francisco. So there's this sort of nice personal story that helps you understand the context through which people start to engage these important issues, but also the personal thing. You know, she's wild. She says naughty things and whatever. As for objectivity, so I guess what I'm just, my only point being, you want people to read. If they don't read, what's the point? As for objectivity, I prefer to say that this book is analytical. I put, I'm sorry, I don't mean the book feels analytical, but what I mean is that it's a process of analysis that leads me to the conclusions that I made. And then it's basically from those conclusions that I'm about truth, that I'm deciding which characters to elevate and how to portray them and things like that. I think that I've put quite a lot of time into understanding the housing mess, and I've put quite a lot of time into seeing it from various perspectives. I spent, 3 months, really a year, but 3 months intensely with this 15-year-old girl while her family, a Latino girl whose mother is very low income, while they're being evicted and displaced. And, I've looked at the activist movements around people like that and spent a lot of time there. And then I spent a lot of time with people like Sonia. I spent a lot of time with developers. And so I believe that effort and that work and the years of research and ground truthing, as they say in the sociology world, gives me some license to write a little more freely than I would if I was just coming to the subject for the first time. But I don't, and I guess I do think I aspired for this book to be journalistic. I hesitate to say that the New York Times would run it exactly this way, but they might. I mean, I do think that if you get to the end of the book, when you get to the end of the book, I think it's hard to say that there's a clear perspective. You gain the perspective of whoever is telling that story at that time. So Sonia's perspective is clearly shown and to some extent celebrated in various parts. But the perspective of Stephanie, this 15-year-old girl, and her battle with the landlord is certainly, you're giving quite a lot of empathy for her, and you do have to wonder if a system that allows her to just be evicted, if a market system that allows someone to be evicted that easily, how can that possibly be just? How can that even be efficient? So I think that when you put it all together, something like, I don't know if you want to call it objectivity, but something like empathy is achieved. And at least that was my aspiration. So I don't think that I do think that it's our job as journalists, if we've put the work in, to say what the truth is, or say what we believe the truth is, the conclusion we came to. That I think that there's tremendous value in that.
Well, I think it's a beautiful book, and I think it's truthful. Yeah, these individuals come to life. These are not abstract people, but they come to life in the pages that you've written. And this is obviously your view. You're letting us see what you've seen. And I think you've done an extraordinary job. And it just it tells an economist who's used to thinking about numbers, how many people are homeless and how that has changed over time, that the reality is this complex stew of individuals who produce the outcome, which it all comes out in his book. Now, another kind of personal story, and then we'll get to the book itself, that I was concerned with is that you emphasize one of the drivers for housing problems, and particularly homelessness, is a growing income inequality and the disappearance of different kinds of jobs. Well, so I looked up the data on newspaper publishing, which had a peak 450,000 jobs in June of 1990, 450,000. And then in February, it went from that 450 down to 121,000, just a tremendous drop in the number of people who are working as journalists. And in April, it went down to 113,000. So I'm wondering if you are on the verge of being homeless yourself in the midst of the job that you have. What's going on with journalism?
So being at the Times is just a tremendous privilege because though we're certainly impacted by COVID-19 and the decline in advertising, the subscription business has been really robust. What the move with the Times' robust subscription business has done to me personally is it just made me feel like, wow, I played some role in that. Like when we see a tiny little role, but when we see our digital subscriptions go up a lot, when we see, all these great trends, I mean, most of which have to do with, frankly, our really amazing political reporters and I mean, but it's a bundle, right? And people subscribe to this thing because there's things that surprise and delight and interest and enrage them every single day. So seeing how well we've done in this environment has actually given me a sense that my work creates value in a way that it just kind of wasn't really as clear to me when the business model was much more on advertising. So I'm not worried about being homeless because the Times has done very, very well. But I am concerned, hugely concerned about local news. The Times, puts a ton of money and resources into hiring people who report stories originally, but let's be honest, like so many of the stories in America are picked away at by the LA Times or the San Francisco Chronicle or the tiny newspapers in small towns. I mean, we take it for granted that we could just kind of Google whatever this some town, and that there'll be some local newsletter or some local something that will tell us something about that place. And taking with the message of what the stats you just brought out is that we shouldn't take that for granted. So we're gonna have to figure out some kind of business model for local news at some point, and I don't know what that is. So let's talk about housing real quick.
Yeah.
What you said, I do think is important. There is and you lay it out perfectly. So what we've seen, as you have documented, is what various economists call the quote barbell economy. At one side of the barbell is a lot of very high-end jobs, which tend to, in some fashion or form, be attached to what are called knowledge industries. People who amplify their talent with a digital device, be it a trading desk or a movie camera or a software platform. And then, of course, there is also like high-end surgeons and other people attached to that side of it. And then there's the other side of the barbell, which is lower paid service workers, jobs in retail, jobs in walking dogs, taking care of, elderly people, jobs where there's very little opportunity for a digital device to amplify their labor and raise their wages, right? And then in the declining middle is these middle skill jobs like manufacturing, where you could use a machine to amplify your labor in such a way that your wages would go up, but you also didn't need a ton of education to learn how to operate this, operate in a factory, right? Would you, as an economist, would you agree with that basic assessment?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. So, so that's what the economy looks like. We could blame some policy failures for that. We could, and I'm sure that's right, but part of it is also organic. The digital world seems to give outsized gains to people who engage in this knowledge work, right? All right, but our housing market does not reflect, okay, so but what's unique about these two ends of the barbell is that until recently, and maybe this is changing, although I don't think it is, they have to be next to each other. They have to be proximal in space, because these knowledge workers, despite all their, even though communication cost is basically zero and they are more equipped to work from home than anybody else in the world, their companies insist on corralling them together because they think that they exchange ideas. I should note that you and Michael Storper wrote a paper on this very thing in like 1998 or 1999. And on top of that, the service workers who are basically servicing, waiting on them really, retail employees, people who walk dogs, take care of old people, whatever, they are performing basically all the jobs that robots can't do. And therefore have to be near them in some way. They have to drive there, they have to be able to get to them and perform some kind of in-person service. And that is what our economy looks like. We could spend a whole 3 hours talking about how that happened in the correct policy response, but for now, that's what our economy looks like. And our housing market looks nothing like that, because we do not have a housing market that reflects the ability of lower income people to afford what their wages will buy, right? And so therefore, we have this massive, inversion you're seeing, where we look more like how European cities look, where we have these very rich neighborhoods in the core, central to jobs, and are pushing lower income people further and further to the fringe and forcing them to endure these mammoth commutes. And I think that the conclusion I come to at the end of my book, which I say pretty forcefully, after investigating all these different people and really getting to know their stories and bringing you into their trials with housing, is that this is going to require basically, and this maybe sounds weak to some people, but a little bit of both sides. You're going to have to build a lot more housing, and some kind of market mechanism and profit motive is going to be part of that. But you're also going to need a really robust policy response, i.e. higher taxes and some sort of direct subsidy to these people who have been left out of the economy, or at least been made to exist with very little chance for mobility at the bottom part of that economy.
So what's the bottom line on your opinion about gentrification? If you knew it's going to occur, do we need to have some kind of control over the speed and have some method of compensating the losers, or just let capitalism operate?
So one thing I did in this book, that a lot of economists kind of dinged me for, was that I became much more sympathetic to rent control. I think that is an area, I'm not saying, I think it's a policy area that is worthy of investigation. I think it's a dial, you can fine tune it. I certainly believe that if, it gets into like really hard price controls, you will retard the market in a way that will leave everyone worse off. But I also believe that, between the tax code and a million other things, we subsidize real estate development to a degree that's really kind of astonishing. In fact, my colleague Jim Stewart wrote a column once after the Trump tax ban and said, it is hard to imagine a tax system that is more favorable to developers than the one we currently have, but somehow they've developed a new one that's even more favorable. And I mean, think about it. Anyway, so my point is this: we should definitely I think we should revisit public housing in some capacity. There's no reason public housing shouldn't work. There are certain things that we can say, well, that's never really worked. Public housing very obviously works in other countries, and it worked in this country for a long time. So I think that's, whether or not you call it public housing or not I'm agnostic to who owns it, and I'm agnostic to who operates it. But the government putting money into the direct building of housing, particularly since the government owns quite a lot of land, seems like a worthy idea of investigation. I talk about that a little bit in the book. And I also think, things like community land trusts and all these things that pull housing off the market, I think all those are good ideas. But I do think you also have to build new market rate housing. I should also note, I'm not a fan, and I'm curious what you think of this, of programs that put all of the burden on either tech companies or developers. And I'll tell you why. They really aren't. For starters, a broad-based tax, taxes should be broad-based because we're all participating in this to a degree, right? I mean, obviously some people have larger contributions and so should pay higher taxes. The concept of a head tax seems like one that makes more sense, because it's philosophically saying, if you have this huge disproportionate effect on our economy, you're going to pay in proportion to that. But when you start, I don't know, leveling it at specific industries rather than specific size, it feels like A, you're missing the point, and B, you're setting yourself up for a tax that's going to make no sense 20 years down the line as the economy changes.
Okay, we have time for one more question. It has to do with African Americans. They play an important role in your book. I owned a home in Bel Air some time ago, and the CC&R said I couldn't sell it to an Ethiopian. And I wondered what your impression is of what seems to be hopeful signs that America's changed its relationship with the Black community, and what that has to do with housing, if anything. You might start in World War II if you want to begin on this.
So obviously, if anybody wants to read anything about this, the two things they should read are Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, which is almost entirely about housing, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and she wrote a piece for ProPublica, which you can Google for free online, called, I forget what the headline is, but it's basically about George Romney and the government's inability to enforce the Fair Housing Act, right? And so when you look at generational robberies of people, the systematic government designed program to specifically exclude African Americans from post-war housing loans, that robbery through the form of housing wealth, to say nothing of the slavery and all that, I mean, just start in 1945, is truly one of the worst robberies we've seen in this country, like, ever. So I think that a concept of reparations around that, certainly something that it seems worthy of study. How you would implement it and all that is, those questions come up. And I guess they're good questions, but they're good questions that we shouldn't be afraid to ask. I basically, we should ask, how are we going to give people better access to good schools? How are we going to share all this wealth we're creating, in the world, and allow people more access to those opportunities? Housing feels central to that conversation, in particular because it's a place where there's so much government policy that you can actually see your way to implementing it in a way that it seemingly makes more logical sense than, I don't know, siphoning the profits off of a tech company and distributing them in some way. Like, you could just sort of imagine a loan program or whatever. I don't know what, right? So I guess that there's this debt that we created, moral debt in this country. We've never even attempted to repay it. And the way that debt was built, again, just in the modern era, I mean, to say nothing of, 400 years ago, really is all centered around housing. And if you look at the wealth gap between African American and white families, it's almost all housing. I don't see how housing isn't central to this. But of course, and as this book, I think, very well illustrates, once you start talking about concrete solutions, the conversation gets so, it gets complicated. But
Your book mentions Proposition 13 and its damage that it does to newcomers and to renters. It benefits those who were landowners when it was passed. Anybody who wants to become a landowner after that is going to be hurt by that proposition. And that would include all the African Americans who are renters and not owners, no?
yes, but Proposition 13 is a weird one. You can find if you go to, I don't know, Leimert Park, which is a pretty middle-class African-American neighborhood in Los Angeles, you will find plenty of people who are big fans of Prop 13. So, Prop 13 in some has its effects, but one of the things I hate about the discussion of Prop 13 is that it's very popular, and people just, I don't know what you say about it. Like, I mean, and really at some level, that's what this book is about, not Prop 13. But here you have a housing problem that we've observed for quite some time. I mean, in the modern sense, this quote unquote NIMBY problem, this problem of making it impossible to build housing, this guy named Bernard Frieden, used to be the head of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, wrote a book about this in 1979. And I guess the question this book asks is like, well, if everyone knew this was such a big problem for so long, I mean, if you go read his book from 1979, which is called The Environmental Protection Hustle, which despite the kind of Fox News title is a very reasonable and well-written book, it's not that much different than today. So at some point, my question, really the kind of guiding question for this book is, if everyone knew this was such a big problem, why didn't anybody even make any attempt to solve it? It's only gotten worse. And on top of that, what would it take to create a political constituency that would put these economists' prescriptions into action? And that kind of led me to Sonia, who is, to some extent, a person fighting for housing that doesn't exist yet. But then it also led me to the kind of counterforces, which is anti-gentrification and people worried about losing their homes. And of course, the answer is it's all very complicated. But I think that the thing that made me optimistic in the course of the book is that by the end of the book, when I first started this book, Sonia and some of these people were basically at the level of like rabble-rousers at a city council meeting. They were literally taking time off work to go to these meetings. They'd gotten some interest from the Silicon Valley. Okay, 4 years later, there's this YIMBY movement around the country. They were supposed to have their 4th annual meeting in April, and Julian Castro was going to speak at it. Julian Castro, the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Every single Democratic candidate had a really robust housing platform with some degree of zoning reform in it. On top of that, on the more leftist side of things, Ilhan Omar put out, I mean, it's kind of a statement, but it's like $1 trillion bill to build more housing, public housing, and then whatever other things. And there's been a huge tenants' rights movement that, even though it's nascent in some ways, we passed statewide rent control in California. So everyone is talking about this. Everyone is worrying about this. We've learned since COVID-19 that crowded housing, which is a consequence of gentrification and a consequence of this inequitable housing market, is much more dangerous than, say, just dense housing. Meaning that if there's more people per bedroom, that's considerably more dangerous than just more people per block. And on top of that, we're now having this huge discussion about should we or should we not cancel rent. So leaving aside any of those policy prescriptions and everything, this is the thing everybody is talking about. And COVID hasn't even really changed that, which is pretty remarkable in and of itself. So the fact that we're all talking about housing and really reconciling with this and putting forth pretty radical solutions, whether they be something like Scott Wiener's upzoning of all of California or this cancel rent movement, there's just a lot of action here, and people have at least started to agree on what the problem is And that alone is pretty rare. So that makes me optimistic that, something will happen. And whether or not the different sides of this battle ever, hold hands and say kumbaya is like not that important to me. If they kind of war it out and we get a couple policies here and a couple policies there and they sum to something better, that's kind of the system working, even though it looks messy and kind of angry along the way.
Well, to conclude, I very much enjoyed the interview. I enjoyed your book tremendously. I think it's a unique style in journalism, and it's very engaging, and it makes it clear that people are the ones who are creating outcomes. Sonia and the other people in your book are extremely interesting to hear about, and let's hope that all the audience is going to go out and buy that book.
Let's hope. Thanks again, Ed.
Okay. Okay.